Welcome to this 10-part series about the Danish author Martinus, hosted by me, Lauge Schøler, and my co-host Karsten Jensen. The aim of this series is to provide an in-depth overview of Martinus and his work, The Third Testament. Martinus is mostly known in Scandinavia. However, there is a growing interest around the world in non-dogmatic approaches to spirituality, and as such, many non-Scandinavian speakers whom we assume will find his teachings interesting. But since most material about Martinus is in Danish, it can be a challenge for people outside of Scandinavia to know where to start or get a proper overview of the material. Over these 10 episodes, we dive into some technical detail as we try to convey some of Martinus' ideas. Martinus' work is vast and complex and takes up over 10,000 written pages, but we have picked 10 of the most central ideas to explore. We strive to make it as accessible as possible, and we hope it can provide the initial understanding of the most basic concepts that will make further study of his text more digestible. If you're interested in Martinus and his cosmology, you're welcome to visit martinus.dk for more information. In Denmark, there's an institute in Copenhagen which maintains the day-to-day administration, and there is a summer holiday center in Klint in northern Sjælland, where people interested in Martinus meet and study his works. Please enjoy. All right, welcome back. This is episode 8, and the title is Development, Evolution, and Intelligent Design. And for a visual aid, I think it could be helpful to look up symbol number 29, which is the long chain of beings. You can see the development of various beings and species through these long lines of development.
Yeah, so this is perhaps also about biological evolution and how that happens. So, of course, when you look at biological evolution, as we know it from the plant kingdom through the animal kingdom and into the various species of animals, when you look at it from the point of view of Martinus, you have to consider, first of all, that it's just it's just a part of this larger cosmological scheme that with the spiral cycle that we have described in a previous episode. That's one thing. And then also you have to consider the structure of the living being, how our physical manifestation is only one part of our being, but behind that, there's this faculty of creation and experience and the I, X2 and X1.
Yeah. And
within the faculty of creation and experience, there is this structure that Martinus calls the element of destiny, which is it's a kind of a memory register in a sense, but it's also where what he calls our talent kernels are stored. So whenever we, through practice, acquire some kind of talent, then you could say the spiritual essence of this talent is kind of stored as what he calls a talent kernel in this element of destiny. And so when we, for example, building up a physical body, that's a talent as well. And it happens automatically, but it only happens automatically because of the fact that we have this kind of storage facility of the kind of talents that we have acquired in previous incarnations. So, of course, you also have to consider the principle of reincarnation here, that we don't start from scratch when we come into incarnation, but we've already acquired a lot of talents through our previous lifetimes, both as animals and before that, even as plants.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and talents are not just playing the piano or speaking languages. Yes, it's part of the talent kernels of intelligence, but it's also creating bodies and creating an organism and having both talent kernels in terms of intelligence and intuition and so on.
The ability to move around. I mean, like you know that it's not all animals that can walk on two legs, for example. So where does that come from? Well, it comes from a practice that is initiated at some point, and eventually becomes an automatism, something we don't have to think about.
Exactly.
And maybe we could talk about here that Martinus is talking about that every kind of knowledge or insight have kind of 3 stages, which he calls the A, the B, and the C stage.
Exactly.
And the A stage is where there's a kind of desire. There's something we want to do. So an example that I think he uses is if you want to play the piano. So you have this theoretical idea that you want to play the piano. And that's kind of the A stage. But then to actually master playing the piano, you have to practice. So practice makes perfect, and which is a saying, and Martinus is using a Danish equivalent of that saying, explaining this principle.
Yeah.
And then eventually, when we've practiced, like there's this saying that it takes 10,000 hours of practice to become a genius at something. And eventually, once we've acquired this mastery and things start to become automatic, we've actually created an organ. And in particular, Martinus would talk about that. So, for example, if you can play piano, it's not a physical organ, but it's a spiritual organ.
Spiritual organ.
That you
incarnating in your nervous system.
Yes, that you kind of draw upon once you sit down to play the piano or any other thing that you master.
So you had the A stage, and then
B stage, that's practice, and C stage is once it becomes automatic. Once you've built up this kind of spiritual organ that you can draw upon through the nervous system, and it's somehow. I'm not sure in detail about how Martinus sees the connection between the kind of spiritual part of this organ and the physical part. But of course, the nervous system is a vital part, the brain. So also, if you study the brain, you can see that there are certain centers that are active in certain kinds of practices. So of course, there's some kind of physical incarnation of this principle.
Physical correlates. Yeah, exactly.
And maybe we could also talk about the brain just briefly here, because according to Martinus, the brain is not the originator of our thoughts. It's more like a receiver of thoughts, ideas, abilities. So it's a receiver and a transmitter, you could say. And just because the brain withers away doesn't mean that our spiritual life, our thoughts and ideas disappear, but they just don't have their physical apparatus, you could say, to be expressed through anymore.
It's a physical apparatus it's like a relay station, right? For
exactly.
Transmitting your spiritual and intellectual organs through a physical organ.
So there are some vibrational patterns in that these talents and so on are stored in that can kind of connect with certain centers in the brain and further through the nervous system and the muscular system and all these things.
Exactly. And that's where you can see that people have a huge variety in intelligence and huge variety in moral development. And it says that many people nowadays on Earth, they have a superstition that we are all morally and intellectually equal. But that's not the case, because there's huge discrepancies, huge variety in like the stages of development.
For sure, for sure. And it takes also, Martinus would make the point that it takes more than one lifetime to master, say, playing the piano as a genius, for example.
I think he meant it takes like 3 incarnations of diligent practice to achieve a virtuoso level.
And so when we look at biological evolution, you could say that it's built up, according to Martinus, in a kind of encounter between the desires of the living being. So even as a plant, you plant beings desire certain things. They desire the sun, the solar light, and there are certain minerals in the ground, and they need water and so on.
Yeah.
So they will kind of orient themselves towards these different resources, and then they will meet resistance, because that's the main property, you could say, of the physical world.
Yeah.
It's the element of resistance, inertia.
Yeah.
And so the reason why we can learn and evolve in the physical world and evolve new talents is because whatever drive we have towards something will always encounter resistance in the physical world. And to overcome this resistance, we have to develop. So there's, in Martinus's view, a kind of, there's an inner pressure to move in a certain direction.
Yeah.
But then there's an outer pressure that kind of resists that tendency. Yeah. And so the whole life in physical existence is about learning how to overcome these challenges and resistances that, of course, change over time, because your desires, what you want, also change over time.
Exactly, and that's one of the finer points that because when you hear about that God is everything and is all loving and so on, then the immediate objection will be like, why don't we just stay in the spiritual world all the time and have a great time there? But the point is that there's no development in the spiritual world, in that part of the spiral cycle. The only real development happens through the resistance in the coarse and dense and material part of the spiral cycle, which is when we incarnate it in physical matter.
Yeah. So yes, sorry.
Yeah, and that's where he talks about mainly two forms of development, which is moral development through feeling, and that's receiving karma and suffering. And you can only to a very limited extent study theoretically what it's like to be morally developed. You have to feel it. You have to feel feelings. You have to know what it's like to be beaten or suppressed or oppressed or tortured or humiliated or whatever it is. So that's the development of morals and feeling. And there's development of intelligence, which has to be done through mastering physical matter to some extent. You have to apply your thinking to solving problems.
Yeah, so to construct a bridge, it's not to fall down. It's you have to be logical about how you go about it. So so you could also say that in relationships we develop feeling. Yeah, and in the struggle for our daily bread, so to speak.
Exactly.
We develop our intelligence.
You also mentioned that our brain is one of the finer points, but it says like our brain is actually predetermined for higher levels of development. He says like there are some latent centers in the brain that are ripe or like proto-ripe for being initiated into like the energy of intuition and cosmic consciousness. And those centers are very vulnerable. And so you have to be very careful with those. And we talk about that in a later episode when he speaks about you shouldn't force development through either advanced meditation techniques or psychedelics or so on, because the development is a natural process that happens gradually.
Yeah, all good development, he would say, happens gradually and organically.
Yeah.
And so it is this interaction between our inner desires and the pressures from the environment.
Yeah. Sometimes we hear that like people are so eager to develop because they have this idea of the real human kingdom. It's like, why don't we just go there now? And it's just like, no, it's a gradual process. You have to go through it step by step. And you can try to manifest it the best you can in your everyday life. Send out good energies. Don't react to bad energies. And then he was asked, well, can't we do some advanced yoga technique or something, some advanced headstand or something that can supercharge our development? He says, no, it doesn't really work like that. And then people kept asking him, what should we do to be developed? And then in the end, he developed this standard answer, which was, well, the most efficient technique to speed up your development is to pray for your enemies.
Yeah. So of course he was, and we come back to that in one of the last two episodes, that the great inspiration behind his work was the behavior of the Christ, and his recommendation that we love our enemies, which is kind of the the peak of our moral development. Exactly. Just when we come to this stage where we can actually love our enemies.
Yeah, and I think we just make a point about the evolution of religious behavior or the religious instinct that Martinus describes, that we as human beings, we go through a pretty set number of stages in terms of how our religion and spirituality looks like. It's just like when we were coming out of Eden or so on, when we are still living in the jungle and living on the savannah and so on, we have our religion and spirituality is this nature mysticism, where we think God is in the rocks, God is in the trees, God is in the heavens, and so on.
Yeah, also called animism.
Yeah, animism.
In modern terms, yeah.
And he says like that way of looking at it is, though not technically true, it's actually closer to the truth than the scientific atheist. Yeah. Yeah, and then usually that, after a while, that morphs into monotheistic religions, that you believe in one God, whether it's God or Allah, or you believe it in, like, through Christianity, Judaism, or Buddhism, or Islam, or whatever. And then usually, not for every person on earth, but this is just a gradual point, or a general point, that then most people develop this atheistic stage, where they have to feel the extreme separation from God and the universe, where they think all religion and all spirituality is just nonsense and a hollow shell. And then usually after you go through that period, you transcend it, and then you come into some sort of cosmological science where you have a logical experience of God, like a logical and feeling-based experience of God.
Yeah, and also you use the term intellectualized. So it's a kind of intellectualized religious perspective on life, also based on your own experience and your ability to be in contact with that which is beyond time and space, and for example, our own eternal nature and the different cosmological principles of life that were never created, but they are simply there all the time as a precondition for life to exist at all.
Yeah. And you mentioned there's various types of people on Earth at the moment, and we don't have time to go into every single one of them, but he usually says that some people have a surplus energy of feeling, which is usually like artists and so on, and like religious fanatics and so on. And then you have people who have a surplus of intelligence, and they're usually mafioso bosses and politicians and engineers, like, just to make a very general claim. And it's just like, and then to achieve cosmic consciousness and become the real human being, you need to have a balance between feeling and intelligence and intuition.
Yeah, and he also relate that to a developmental picture, because as you mentioned, there are these, he would call it world impulses.
Yeah.
So the animistic, politistic religions were inspired by a very ancient world impulse, and we talked about that, I think, also on an earlier occasion.
Yeah.
And so right now there are three impulses that are affecting human life.
Yeah.
And so we can see that you have these original populations on all the continents that are kind of the residue in terms of, it's a cultural residue, you could say, from this very ancient world impulse, and it's dying out now. And then you have what he calls the old world impulse, which is what created these large monotheistic religions.
Yeah.
And then the atheistic stage is actually the beginning of a new impulse.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of transition into a new impulse that started. The first precursor was the birth of natural science in the 17th century.
Yeah.
He calls it the scent of the sea, or the scent of the ocean, and that has developed over a few centuries. And then after that, you have in early 20th century, you would say, there was a new impulse, and Martinus himself was drawing on this new impulse.
They came around 1920, right?
Yeah. In writing his work, he was drawing, and also you had perhaps a small precursor there in the changes that happened in modern science with quantum physics and theory of relativity and things like that.
Yeah.
But then around 1920-21, there was this very strong impulse that set in, and kind of, so there are these larger impulses, but within them you can see smaller impulses. So also you mentioned on a previous occasion that in 1973, I think it was, there was a minor impulse as well that liberated the sexuality and the psychic area.
Yeah.
So there are these three main impulses.
I think just to mention the first one is like around 1900, right? Which released the modern science, modern physics. That's what you mean?
No. What I mean is the first impulse was animism, polytheistic religions. Yeah. The next was polytheistic religions, then monotheistic religions. Yeah. But also philosophy, for example, was also born in this period. Yeah. But then you have this onset of the third impulse that Martinus is drawing upon. But I'm just making the point that within the larger impulses, there are smaller things happening. And Martinus didn't go into a lot of detail. Yeah. But he was mainly focusing on these three larger world impulses, where the latter one, the one he's drawing upon, he calls the New World Impulse. And this is where we enter into the phase of spiritual science and intuition becoming active in human beings as a method of realization.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's part of the whole grander plot, and we touched about it in previous episodes, about evolution and involution, because I think most people are familiar with the term evolution, something has to develop, but the twin of that is the involution, which is like you go into matter in involution from the spiritual into matter, and then you go up from matter into the spiritual through evolution.
Yeah, and it also happens on a smaller scale that you get involved in something. I mean, for example, you marry. That could be considered a kind of involution. Yeah. And then you evolve out of this stage where marriage or matrimonial status is something you desire. So whenever we involve ourselves within something that has to teach us something, and which we will eventually be liberated from, you could call the part where you go into something. It's an involutionary process, and then you evolve out of it at some point. So it also has to do with hunger and satiation.
Yeah, and that's and it's all part of the grander plan. And Martinus mentioned he makes some references to the Old Testament, right, where he says that the serpent usually gets a bad rap, like the serpent in the Garden of Eden, right? But he says like it was not a evil being seducing Adam and Eve to eat the apple. It was a cosmic impulse to open your eyes to engage with matter.
Yeah, so the serpent symbolizes a world redeemer at an earlier stage in time.
Yeah, and I think like usually when you talk about evolution, most people think about Darwinism, right? And usually what we talk about here is like neo-Darwinism, like the modern atheistic interpretation of Darwinism. But I think it's one of the key contrasts that we'll develop here, that in neo-Darwinistic terms, then evolution has no direction. It's a really important point. It's like a blind mechanism that just, like organisms in the neo-Darwinian worldview, just develop through random mutations that just happen out of nowhere. And then the mutations that happen to work beneficially for survival, they'll be passed on through the genes to the next generation.
Yeah, so so there is a kind of direction, because the environment creates a pressure upon organisms that kind of make for some attributes surviving, some kinds of species surviving, and so on.
Yeah.
So, but but it's not a teleology, as it's called. It's not a goal that the living being has for itself.
Yeah.
Although they're still talking about this drive for survival.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of goal as well. But normally these things are thought about in terms of there not being a goal, things just happening by accident, and then the collision between what accidentally occurs in terms of new species or new attributes for certain species, and then this environmental pressure that kind of selects for the most fit species or individuals or attributes.
Whereas Martinus would say that you learn something through an incarnation, and then it's stored in your talent kernels, and then you keep that for the next incarnation.
And I think the great difference is that desire is kind of so when we talk about a plan, it's not because there's something else apart from the universe that planned how the universe should unfold or how beings should unfold. But it's more like beings have and make plans for themselves. And that happens on all kinds of levels. So we make plans for ourselves that will kind of affect all the microbeings that live in our organism.
Exactly.
So when they contemplate the divine plan, it's trying to figure out where we're going, and it's in the same sense that at every level you can try to work out what is the plan here, because at higher levels there will be beings that have a certain kind of desire. So again, when Martinus is quite confident that we're moving towards this true or real human kingdom, is because this is something that's happening to the planet being right now. And if we don't want to follow that lead, we'll have to find some other planet to incarnate on, because there won't be conditions of life on this planet for other kinds of manifestation.
Exactly, and there's also, I don't want to open the whole can of worms in terms of free will discussion, but like it's just an interesting point that it seems like it's going on rails. There's this development we're going through. Like you go evolution, evolution, and then going from animal to real human beings and so on. And like when you hear that for the first time, it sounds like, well, like there's no free will. If you're just on this track, you're just driving like from one stage to another. But like the point is that there's many ways of like exploring free will within that scheme.
Yeah, and even also the scheme exists because of our desires. It exists because we become satiated with certain conditions and long for some other. So one way to put it is also that this rhythm is kind of creating a space within which we can unfold our freedom. And of course, we are more or less free. So Martinus would say cosmically, we are unconditionally free. But at a certain point in our evolutionary process, we have degrees of freedom, having to do with how much insight we have into the laws of life. So it's just like you can be captured in a room because you don't know how to open a door. And then, of course, our freedom can be limited because we simply don't know how to overcome these resistances and challenges that we meet in our everyday life.
Exactly. And the more you set other people and other beings free, the more free you'll be yourself. If you constrain other people, you also feel a sense of...
Yeah, that's the karmic aspect, yeah. So you can limit yourself, your own freedom by limiting the freedom of others.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, of course, there are a lot of things that we're doing all the time, like we keep animals captivated, for example, and direct their lives into certain directions that are not necessarily an expression of their desires and what they need. And so there are so many other ways when we suppress somebody, if we have power and using that power to suppress somebody, we limit their freedom. And then, of course, there is this principle that all manifestations move in circles. Yeah. So it will eventually come back to ourselves as an experience we'll have to go through.
Yeah, exactly. And Martinus also says that he agrees that we developed from the ape and monkey stage. It's just that it was actually us in that state of being, and then we were in the monkey body, and then through incarnation after incarnation after incarnation, we become more and more refined, both in terms of our bodies and in terms of our mentality and thinking.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily one of the kind of monkeys that exist right now, but it's some kind of forefather, perhaps even to both monkeys and man.
Yeah, and he says like that he says that many other species of more ape-like humans that has been on Earth has died out long ago, like Neanderthals and Cro-Magnon and Homo erectus and so on. These pre-human stages.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And then there's also an interesting point here that evolution of the individual actually mirrors the evolution of the species. And it says like, especially from age 0 to 30, we are kind of recuperating the evolutionary history of the species.
Yeah, and maybe we should mention that this principle already exists in biology. Yeah. Where there was this German scientist, Hegel was his name, who came up with this idea that we recuperate earlier stages of biological evolution as fetuses. Yeah. So in the womb, we will go through different evolutionary stages, and I think that's quite accepted in biology.
Yeah, even in mainstream biology.
Yeah. So, but Martinus kind of elaborates that into a spiritual principle. Yeah. So it's not only biology that is this reiteration of previous stages of evolution, but even when we come into our life, we spend the first 30 years, as you said, reiterating the different stages, cultural stages and moral stages and so on that we've been going through in previous lifetimes.
Yes, so it's both biological and psychological.
Yeah.
So like biological, you're in a repeating the fish stage, actually, when you're in the womb, in the water, and then you come out as a little monkey, right? And you behave like a monkey for a while, and then you gradually develop into this human being you are in now at that stage. And also, there's a physical, biological evolution, but also you repeat the mental stages that you have been going through in the past eons of time, right? Through like hundreds and thousands of incarnations and so on. And as like I've sometimes said to people, well, if you wanna see how tribal society worked, just look at kindergarten kids, or just look at like preschoolers, because they have repeating these tribal mechanisms.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
and also he gave a few numbers. I'm not sure I can remember exactly, but I think he said, for example, when you're in your 20s, you repeat something like 5 or 6 incarnations.
Yeah. So in the beginning, you repeat incarnations really, really quick.
Yeah.
And then in the beginning, like really fast, and then it goes slower and slower and slower. And then between age 20 and 30, how many did he say it was?
I think it was 5 or 6.
Yeah, 5 or 6. And then the last 2 or 3 is between age 25 and 30 and so on.
Yeah.
I mean, the exact number is not that important. But
no, it's more the principle.
Yeah.
So there's So the last lifetimes we've had, we spent more time in this life reiterating, and the earlier. So in the womb, for example, it's the whole biological evolution from through the whole spiral cycle, you could say, until the human stage that we have to reiterate.
I think it's also just to make a side point here is that one of the reasons why usually your childhood subjectively feels like a really long time is that you have to literally go through the entire span of evolution.
It's a lot to cover, a lot of ground to cover.
A lot of insights. That's what it be like. You can see like kids, they learn really quick, right? And then the ability to learn like kind of slows down as you age.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And also, like, this is a point that, so if you want to figure out exactly how highly developed you are and how intelligent you are, then usually at the age around the age of 30, you'll arrive at where you were when you died the last time, when you disconnected the last time.
Yeah. So in a sense, our life, this present life, actually starts when you're age 30.
Yeah, around age 30, and then you hit the ground running, and then it's time for like the proper development here in this incarnation. And you die again, and then you discarnate, and then you go back in Israel again.
Yeah, and last time we talked about, 1 or 2 times ago, we talked about this spiral cycle and the different kingdoms in the spiral cycle.
Yeah.
And what, according to Martinus, happens between incarnations is that we also take part in the planning of our next life.
Yeah.
And we have this overview where we can look back a few lifetimes, maybe 2 or 3 lifetimes back, and we can look a bit into the future because we can see some tendencies and we have some desires in terms of where we want to go, and we have the knowledge about, we have a clear side about, say, weaknesses we have that we might want to improve upon and so on.
Exactly.
So also when we come into incarnation, we come in with a kind of plan for our life.
It's very common that people have some themes they're working on. Yeah. Right? Either like it's jealousy or anger or like practical problem solving or whatever it is.
So just to give an example, I can see, so I'm around 60 years old now, and looking back at my life, I could see it in my life, it was kind of a theme. So that, first of all, there's some issues in terms of relationships to other human beings, my family and so on. Yeah. There were things that I had to work out. But also, I came into this incarnation with kind of a small surplus, perhaps, of feeling over intelligence.
Sure.
And so after I had finished my reiteration of previous lifetimes, I decided that I want to educate myself as an engineer, which was actually quite foreign to me. It's kind of a foreign world that I entered into.
Yeah.
But I came in with a need for these challenges that studying engineering and later become a researcher in natural science gave me. Yeah. And so I can see that's been a theme for this lifetime to kind of achieve a better balance between feeling and intelligence.
Exactly.
And I think that's probably true for a lot of people, that we're working with these imbalances. Yeah. And then the kind of circumstances that are created for us are meant to allow us to work with these imbalances and become more balanced beings.
Exactly, and you can also see it in the interests that children have as they grow up. Because I think if you are like a kindergarten teacher, a primary school teacher, a high school teacher, it doesn't take like more than 5 or 10 minutes to realize that some people have way more ability in one area than they have in other areas. And you can see like what they have been, and I think as an expression of what they have been doing in past lifetimes. Some people are very socially intelligent. Some people are very keen on music. Some people are like natural born engineers and so on. And you usually see that with the very young people. They have some talent and you don't know where it comes from, right? They can either play an instrument hardly without any effort, or they're extremely interested in like hydraulics or like computer science or something that, and and as an adult, you don't know where this interest come from, and they seem to just absorb and draw from a well of knowledge way beyond this world.
And it's also sometimes you see people who have talents but suddenly lose interest in applying them because they have this desire to take their life in another direction.
Yeah, same thing. I was super interested in philosophy, for instance, up till around the age of 25, 26, and then I just got fed up with it. And I'm like, okay, I need to do something else. And I really had that feeling in me, like I need to do other things than reading philosophy books because it doesn't give me any more pleasure.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess the kind of basic driving force behind our evolution is our desire to have a life in fuller measure, you could say.
Yeah.
A life of more fulfillment. Yeah. And what that means in detail is different for each one of us because it depends on where we're coming from.
Yeah.
And that will have an effect on where we're going.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Maybe we should also mention that in the discussions about evolution, there's this dichotomy that this discussion that has been going on between the theory of evolution and the theory of intelligent design.
Yeah.
And one thing that you could say about Martinus is that he actually unifies, in a sense, these two theories.
Yeah, I was just about to get to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because usually when you grow up, and most people don't know about Martinus, then there's usually two cosmologies or worldviews presented to them. It's either everything is random and happens through mutation and random selection. It was more like the atheistic worldview, or it's like the dogmatic Christian intelligent design theory that says like the universe and the whole thing, the universe and the earth and so on, was created 6,000 years ago and just put there in place in this very static environment.
Also, I think there are more elaborate theories of intelligent design. So it's not necessarily that the Earth was created 6,000 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, that's the most dogmatic version of it.
Yeah. So, but there are much more elaborate intelligent design theories that without having this rather ridiculous view that the Earth was created 7,000 years ago, they still want to argue for there being some kind of cosmic designer, a godhead that has that. So one of the, one of the arguments is that you can see that evolution doesn't happen gradually. Yeah. You have these periods where there's very rapid acceleration, and so it has been argued, for example, that this cannot happen only by accident. And so that's been an argument for intelligent design. Martinus doesn't go into that, and I don't think we should either. But the thing is that he kind of, you have this kind of combination where there is evolution, and evolution is kind of the basic principle of life. All life is about change and everlasting evolution, and involution, you could say. Yeah. But at the same time, he makes room for the divine principle having a role in that. But we are not disconnected from this divine principle. Yeah. It's inherent in each living being. Yeah. So each living being participate in the divine. Yeah. And also there is this relationship where, in a sense, we become divinities for each other, in the sense that the macroorganisms become a kind of divine protection mechanism for the microorganisms.
Yeah, in terms of divine providence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you could say Martinus, he draws upon some of these traditional terms that has been passed down through, in particular, Christianity, because his main source of inspiration in terms of religiosity is the Christian tradition. Yeah. So he will also, as you mentioned earlier, he would analyze passages in the Bible, also in the Old Testament, and relate that to the process of evolution. Yeah. So, for example, if you take the creational story in the Bible, with Adam being born as the first man, and then Eve being born out of Adam. Yeah. He has a certain interpretation that there's a kind of symbolism in this narrative where Adam is actually a symbol for the original androgynous being, and even Eve is not a woman, but it's a symbol for the heterosexual being, the being that is either male or feminine,
the one pole being,
one pole being, as you call it.
And that's where it comes from, like being unified as double pole and separates out into the single pole beings.
Yeah. So Martinus draws a lot upon the terms, you could say, from the Christian tradition. But he aligns it with this kind of evolutionary cosmology that is kind of the backbone of his whole cosmology.
Exactly. Yeah, the thing is, like with Martinus, his key points in terms of evolution is that it's both gradual and designed. So it's not random gradual evolution. It's like it is a kind of sort of planned gradual evolution, because we are developing and all these organisms, which you touched on in previous episodes, these organisms that we have, the human body, the organs, and so on, those are designed, in quotation marks, in the divine world and in the kingdom of wisdom.
Yeah, and but still we should maintain, when we talk about planning and so on and purpose, there's our own desires that at least play a part in how things unfold. So it's not... you can say it's not a plan that's impressed upon us from the outside, but it's rather a plan that is unfolding from within.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also, I mean, it's also, you see, as I mentioned in the previous episodes, that a lot of the organs we have, they are so intricate. If you look at how the eyes work or how the kidneys work, and so on. And you think, would they really develop through random mutations and random evolution? Because they're so intricate and they're so well designed, like they are much more advanced than many machines that we can produce with our best efforts, right?
Yeah, and I'd say that's a kind of classical intelligent design argument, and Martinus also draws upon that. So, but again, it's like so there is this kind of, what he calls it, the divine workshop in the kingdom of wisdom or intelligence, where these mechanisms somehow are developed, and it also ties into what I think we talked on a previous episode about how you have these two different metaphors for the universe. Is it a machine or a mechanism, or is it an organism? And Martinus would actually use both terms. So he says about the whole universe, it's a living being, but at a certain point he also says that the whole universe is a machine. And what he means there is that if you focus only on the physical part, that's actually a tool. So even organisms are elaborate machines, you could say. So and you could also, perhaps, if you look at the technology we develop right now, so we have technologies like robotics and so on, and you could see that as kind of experiments, very primitive experiments in a sense. And also in human science, there's this desire to create living organisms, and you could see this desire as a very kind of primitive starting point into a future where we will be engaged in evolving and co-creating new organisms that can populate new planets, all different kinds of variations.
Yeah.
So it's also a very important point with Martinus that although there's this kind of predictability in evolution due to this principle of cyclicity, in detail the number of variations are infinite.
Yeah.
So the kind of organisms we have now are probably never seen before in evolution or in any other place in the universe. There will be minor differences that has to do with differences in environmental pressure and so on.
Exactly, because like I think like the dominant species on other planets could look completely different from us.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
I mean they could look like us because they people transmigrate through this
and they could be similar if it's similar environments, but also there might be differences, small differences, because no two planets have exactly the same circumstances in terms of what kind of solar system they're a part of and so on.
Exactly. Yeah.
So there's this infinite possibility for experimentation with particular life forms, but there are some overall principles that are the same over time and across different areas of the universe.
Yeah. And also true that, and I heard some people who advocate for more comprehensive and advanced theory of intelligent design is that, for instance, like protein folding and so on, if you and enzymes and so on, if you mess with just a little bit of that, like one or two proteins, the whole thing falls apart. So if you do random mutations in that, it'll just collapse into.
Yeah, and also you don't see all the combinations that you see if it was just random. Not that I'm an expert, but I've seen that there are only certain ways to fold a protein out of the many possibilities that you have that you actually see.
Yeah, that's true, and there's also this argument that is usually used that just randomness, like a hurricane going through a whole stack of building materials, cannot just like manifest a house.
Also, there's a law of thermodynamics. I mean, the second law of thermodynamics.
Yeah.
And it also have to do with time, having a direction.
Yeah.
So things don't. I mean, normally, if something is not, say, impressed upon willfully, it will simply dissolve and degenerate.
Exactly.
So if we look at mineral matter, for example, it wears down over time. Whereas in living organisms, there's this inner desire. Yeah. So actually, there's I think if you go back to the philosopher Immanuel Kant, he had a definition of life where he distinguished between the distinction between a living organism and a machine was that a living organism has an inner purpose. It has a purpose for itself, whereas a machine only has an outer purpose. And you could say that the problem with the theistic intelligent design model is that, in a sense, it sees God as something that is outside its creation and creating a purpose, or creating with a purpose, not for the creation itself, but for God. Yeah. And Martinus, the view Martinus has is a bit different. So he would be, I think, sympathetic to Kant's idea that which is characteristic of life is that it has a purpose for itself. It has an inner purpose that is driving the evolution forward.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's like if it was all random, like true randomness, it'll be the same as just a static on a TV screen, and then nothing would happen, right? Or like
for sure, yeah.
Like billiard balls on a pool table, just bouncing around. That doesn't create anything. It's just like random bouncing around.
There's a lot. I don't think we should go further into that. Yeah. There's a lot that could be said about that.
Sure thing. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, one thing, just the last thing. I mean, when we look at the world, it very often looks very chaotic.
Yeah.
So it's natural that people come to think that things are happening by accident.
Yeah.
But the image Martinus would use here is that if you see a building site in an unfinished state, it will also look very messy and chaotic.
Yeah.
So sometimes also, I mean, you can come into a web page and nothing is happening because you have this under construction label.
Yeah.
And this is what Martinus says about things that apparently are very chaotic and erratic.
Yeah.
That there should be this label saying under construction.
Under construction. Yeah.
Because there is a plan, and what is seemingly chaotic and erratic will eventually turn out to be a part of this construction process.
Yeah, and it's usually the thing that you mentioned a couple of times, that don't judge the unripe fruit, because like both the human beings in our current state are not ripe, and the planet is almost ripe but not completely ripe.
Yeah, exactly.
So it looks like those birth pangs. It looks chaotic, and like you can get a lot of anxiety from looking at the world in terms of like political situation or climate or whatever. Like, oh, it's all going to hell in a handbasket, right? But actually, it's part, like those karma bursts. They're part of the birth pangs. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Should we end it here?
I think so.